Anytime you're talking about prevention or risk reduction, you're generally also talking about either increasing cost or increasing complexity of operations for the affected stakeholders. Unfortunately, outbreaks like this do serve as a case study of kind of what happens if prevention measures aren't kept up, if regulatory measures aren't maintained, or if these prevention measures fail. New World Screwworm is a fly-borne disease that has historically been observed in Central America. And until recently, it was contained there through a combination of efforts around observation and monitoring, managing affected livestock. It's a disease whose primary impact is, or at least the impact we're primarily concerned with, is its impact on cattle, specifically cattle raised as part of agriculture and the closer nature of the way cattle are kept, particularly at different stages throughout the cattle breeding cycle, can be problematic for this disease and the spread of this disease. So historically, it's been monitored quite closely, and outbreaks have been prevented or managed through the breeding and distribution of sterile flies. This is a technique that got some news a number of years back when it was in discussions for managing mosquitoes in Florida and other moist and subtropical regions of the US. The technique is that you breed a sterile version of the vector. So in this case, flies, in the mosquito example, mosquitoes, and then you release those sterile flies into the affected areas. They breed with wild disease-bearing populations, and then the offspring are sterile and unable to breed, or the sterile population released doesn't have offspring, and so that creates a population bottleneck, and the disease vectors dies off after that event. So historically, that method had been very effective at managing New World screwworm-bearing fly populations in Central America, such that they weren't able to come into the US and begin infecting US agriculture. I think regulations that encourage or promote monitoring or observation are always helpful in mitigating outbreaks, reducing future outbreaks, and ending outbreaks quickly when they do occur. I think the increased funding for sterile fly production that they've pushed through in the last several months will also help on a go-forward basis managing these outbreaks. Regulations around kind of what to do with infected animals and how best to manage those remains and best practices in managing the rest of the herd are always supportive of dealing with these outbreaks effectively. A big piece of it was that in the government streamlining operations last year, a number of government programs were cut who were focused on kind of the observation and monitoring of these diseases and these fly populations in Central America. So as we see that funding either restored or programs spun up, we would expect to see that disease go back to a containment steady state like we had seen previously. Anytime you're talking about prevention or risk reduction, you're generally also talking about either increasing cost or increasing complexity of operations for the affected stakeholders. Unfortunately, kind of events like this, outbreaks like this, although we still don't know what the full scope of that will look like, do serve as a case study of kind of what happens if prevention measures aren't kept up, if regulatory measures aren't maintained, or if these prevention measures fail. So it's a complicated conversation, but I think everyone can agree on kind of the need for stronger measures when we're looking at an event like we are now. When we're speaking with groups that are looking at best practices to implement in situations like this, we often encourage them to look at the spirit and intended effect of regulations or official guidance rather than what the strict letter of the guidance may say. So if guidance advises to be steam treating or heat treating a specific type of material or materials that may come into contact with infected animals, think about what those regulations are trying to promote, think about what they're trying to prevent, And in cases where you have something that maybe it's not exactly what's described by the letter of the regulations, but you feel like it probably falls into that category, being too careful is better than not being careful enough. And if the spread is contained earlier or if extra precautions are taken, the incremental amount of upfront cost is normally orders of magnitude lower than it ends up being if not.